not all problems lend themselves to structural solutions. So if we look more at the operational things, and I'll hand back to you guys to talk through things like options to insure for long-term absence.
Thanks, Niels. I've seen you do that a couple of times, or those slides, and I learn something every time I see it. It's fascinating. But I think that's a really, really important point. And we knew when we were putting this sort of joint presentation together that a lot of the conversation was going to be around the structural stuff, because that's so important. That idea that if you can mitigate as much of your many of your problems and many of those risks that you listed by getting your structure right for you, what that then leaves is these operational problems, and you're back into the sort of challenges that we have at practice level. Let's take that example of the incorporated PCN. Suddenly everybody's employed by that group. We have a group who have clear liabilities, and you then know these are our remaining risks. And Niels, you mentioned earlier, with those remaining risks, you've got a choice to either accept them or do something about protecting against them. And long-term absence is probably the most common thing. Now, we've had an extraordinary 2 years right across the world. And one of the things that we're getting lots of questions about now at all levels of primary care is about, well, what can we do? We're expecting rates of absence and the consequences of all the last 2.5 years to come home to roost, is what we're being told. But the great news is, if you've gone through the process that Niels has said, and you've decided whatever your structure is, we're then in a position to say, right, let's look at these remaining risks. Let's look at long-term absence. Let's look at what would happen if your clinical director or your practice manager leads, or your PCN manager or your R's staff were off absent. Take the R's staff there. The first thing we look at is the capacity you've got within the funding to pick up those. Are you at risk of incurring additional costs? Do you have a lot of capacity? If it's the latter, you're probably okay to this as it is. But actually, if you're at capacity on the funding or getting close towards it, additional costs become then a network cost, and then what funding you have, it will probably be passed on to the network. So can you protect against it? Great news is exactly the same as we've been doing for years at practice level. You can protect against those absences of the people employed through the PCN, be they through the R scheme, or be they clinical directors, be they managers, or whatever. There is a solution available to you. Clinical directors is one I just wanted to pop on. I mentioned earlier about the different ways of funding, because in some situations, and many situations, the funding for a clinical director goes to the practice. So again, an example of making sure you understand your structure is who's liable to replace that person if the clinical director is absent for 6, 9, 12 months. Is it the PCN or is it actually the practice? And we've actually had both scenarios. But again, finding the solution to protect it isn't difficult. It's making sure that the right person takes out the solution, and that comes back to getting the structure and understanding where your liabilities lie. So that's really a very, very simple message, that once you understand your structure and you know what risks remain, talk to us. We can look at what your options are to do so. And it falls down to that very, very simple decision of, is this liability one that we're prepared to accept within our network, or is this one that we actually need to do something about, moving that liability away from us and onto an insurer, insurance company, through via a policy? So that's very much the long-term risk. Cab, you talked about some of the problems with potential risks around cyber and data. What sort of solutions it would be about?
Yeah, so with data and cyber, I think the first and biggest and probably the most cost-effective sort of solution to data and cyber, it starts with the staff, you, and everybody else who handles that data. And I suppose predominantly the important thing is making sure you have rigid training plans in place to help staff understand what data is, what they're doing, and how they're handling that data. and what they can do to prevent it. So obviously most systems, I think, ever more so now in the digital age, and particularly when we are logging into systems, there's these two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication when you're logging onto systems. So get those added onto the systems. But then it comes raising awareness with staff, so making sure they understand what phishing and all these sort of digital hacking terminologies are, making sure they understand. So simple things like, opening up an email with something that they might not recognize or doesn't look right. Classic example, I'm using me as a person. Now I work in insurance and I should understand these risks, but I felt sort of victim to it. A few months ago, my TV license, I knew in the back of my head it was due at some point. I had an email come through to say your TV license is due. Can you log in and put your account details in there? And because it was in the back of my mind, it was due. I replied to the email, put my account details, and within literally half an hour, all I'm getting is notifications to say, there you go, and you've spent money in Apple or somewhere else and somewhere else. And it can be easily done because it looked exactly like how you'd expect it. And these things are often easy to do and easy to fall prey to. But when it comes to PCN network, as I said, this data is now being shared across platforms, across businesses. Inevitably, how do you protect that? Well, the only way you can protect that is either to accept the risks involved or get yourself some sort of cyber coverage. And what that cyber coverage will allow you to do is not only help against help against the cost that you could be incurred now, whether that's the fines and things that come from the information commissioners, ransom that's demanded against it, but more importantly, the reputational damage that it can cause if something leaks out. So investing in a good cyber and data security insurance would be one example. But more importantly, and I would say the one thing which is cost effective, make sure you raise awareness with your staff constantly. There's always something, some email somewhere waiting for someone to click on and almost hack into their system.
Nils,
the
I think
other part which we talked about. Sorry.
So Nils, I'll just.
Nils, sorry.
Just to say, I think in previous conversations you've mentioned the importance of data sharing agreements as well.
Indeed, I mean, as part of your PCN, actually, you've signed up to that you will sign a data sharing agreement between the practices, and of course, if you involve a company, you need that as well. In my experience, keep it to yourselves, but I don't know many PCNs that have done it. Now, why is that? That's because, to be honest, it's quite hard, because you can't just sign a data sharing agreement. And I know there are templates out there. There's 2 templates which were issued, and they were issued because there's a lot of pressure on people to issue the templates. But the reality is, to get data sharing agreements right, you've got to get down into the nitty-gritty of what's really happening with the data, which means within the PCN, what you actually need to do is go and understand what is everybody doing in terms of data sharing. So your clinical pharmacist, what are they actually doing? They're employed in practice A, they're doing something in practice B, but what are they doing? And until you've understood those processes, you can't really, to be honest, even document a data sharing agreement, because it's those processes which define who's the controller, who's the processor, what's the data, and what should go on the on the statements. So unfortunately, data sharing is a really, really horrible area where, in my experience, most PCNs actually need to do a lot of work before they can document it, and then they should come to us and get the data sharing agreement. Far too often people come to us and say, can you just write a data sharing agreement? And as well, yeah, but what are you sharing? That's unfortunately the work that needs to be done. So sorry everybody, but that's a bit of homework for you to get that one right.
Yeah, and that kind of leads nicely into presents another risk there in itself. So Nils, as you mentioned, obviously there needs to be processes and guidelines in place. Now, what happens if the lead clinician or the manager, whoever's managing that PCN and is responsible for that, What happens if they do get that process wrong or misadvised or misinformed? Well, what happens then? Who's going to be held responsible here? That then becomes sort of that the personal liability onto the leader. Now, as a PCN, forget using the PCN sort of definition, as a owner of a business, and I'm going to use business now because that's what this model is. As a business owner, they have a responsibility to manage the day-to-day affairs in a fair and in a dutiful way. If something goes wrong, ultimately, it's not the business that's going to be held responsible or liable. It's going to be that individual person. Now, that could be as simple as not ticking something on a health and safety sort of process correctly. It could be not having a proper HR process in place. It could be a number of things. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a PCN network, and this business owner who's now been tasked to lead the whole PCN network, they've got this whole other rack of responsibilities across multiple practices and things. Well, who's going to be liable? Well, it is going to be, unfortunately, that individual person, because if something goes wrong in practice B, they will hold you responsible if something's not done. So, for example, if an employee, if a HR process is not put in place, whereby how to raise, I suppose, grievances, if that process has not been followed or not done, it falls on this person over here, the lead practitioner or the lead clinician. You then have liabilities from, I suppose, running of the business, so the financial sort of situation. So as a lead clinical director, the funds that come in, you are moving that money across equally or dividing it however it is divided across the PCN networks. What if you get accused of unfairness? Well, again, you're going to be held responsible. So there lies another that whole host of risks involved here. It's not just the business at risk, whether it be cyber insurance or the business insurance. You now have personal risks, and unfortunately, that's something that needs to be raised awareness of. And there are insurance policies in place. Going back to what you said, Nils, earlier on, I think the best way to look at sort of risks and how to mitigate it is basically identify the risk, sit down, work out what the business risks are, what the risks are to individuals, whether it be employees, you as the lead clinical director, what are those risks? Then you find out how you can mitigate it, work that out. Now, whether that's speaking to specialists, whether it's speaking to legal counsel, whoever that might be, understand what and how to mitigate it. And I suppose the final bit is then you either accept those things, as Neil said, or you find a way to protect it. Now, there are insurances in place, but unfortunately, the world we live in, not everything is insurable. So some you're going to have to accept, but some you can protect. They can be costly. My advice would be is speak to your insurance broker, speak to a risk specialist, and understand those first and foremost.
Indeed. So if we look back at, the summary of the risks we went through at the beginning, the short answer is that all of these risks, most PCNs are going to have at least some of them, and if not all of them, and they can all be dealt with in different ways, or you can accept them. But the first, well, how many it is there, they're structural. They can be dealt with in structural ways, and the last three, they're operational, and you can deal with them in operational ways. Obviously, you want to mitigate your risks by as best you can internally, training, etc. And if you're still uncomfortable, then you look for the insurance, the operational risk. So in many ways, PCNs, in that sense, are no different to practices. But if you get your structure right, then it actually helps and becomes much clearer which entities the residual operational risks are in, and then it becomes much easier to insure them.